So let us continue where we left off. So just to remind you all of where we were, so let us continue where we left off. So just to remind you all of where we were, weary. Okay, so just a reminder of what the next world is like.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
a reminder about the next
You'll
one.
be watching.
Is it going out or is it coming in?
Oh, no, it's yeah,
That was over.
expanding and contracting.
Yeah,
Deep stuff. Yeah.
that's intense.
Okay, I'm glad you enjoyed. All right, let us continue with where we were. So remember, we saw a Mishnah that had taught us that Rabbi Tarfon relates about himself that he once had stopped while he was traveling. As it was getting dark, he went and lay down on the side of the road to recite Kriya Shema because he wanted to go according to the opinion of Beis Shammai. And the rabbis told him, and he said, I almost got killed by bandits because when they found me lying on the side of the road, they thought they could take advantage of me. And I only got, we don't know the details of the story, but presumably he only escaped narrowly.
Is that operating properly, Robert? This looks like it's previous recording on the screen.
No, it's working. It's working. I'm just let me move it aside so it's not distracting. Okay. So in any event, so I endangered my life, and the rabbis told him that you would have deserved to die for having violated the law that once it was established that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, you're not allowed to violate, even to go lechumra, and to go against Beis Hillel, and to be machmer like Beis Shammai. Now that is a little bit unusual, right? Because normally we say that if a person wants to be machmir, let him be machmir. But apparently there's a concern that if people start going like Beis Shammai, once the halacha has been paskin like Beis Hillel, this could create a schism within the Jewish community. And on a, for social cohesion, you don't have a right to go like an entire academy that we've already rejected. So that doesn't always apply, and we're going to clarify that a little bit further. But let's go ahead in the Gemara.
Beis Shammai always.
Not always. Not always. Yeah, there's certain instances. Yeah, I don't remember the number of cases, but I think it's more than 5. But
yeah,
there are situations where sometimes, like the one example is Beitza Shenolda B'Yom Tov. That's the beginning of Maseches Beitza. There, the Gemara says that Beis Shammai is more lenient than Beis Hillel as far as the laws of Nolad, which is a form of Moktzah. And in any event, we had started off this Gemara by saying, Chavraya b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. We'll just start from the bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Beis once again. Chavraya b'shem Rabbi Yochanan dodim divrei sofrim l'divrei Torah. That the words of the sages, sofrim is another word of describing the sages. And the reason why they're called sofrim is because one of the tasks of the sages is to be so fair, is to count the words of the Torah very carefully, like a person is counting gems, and really analyzing them and explaining them carefully. So they are just as precious as the words of Torah themselves. B'chavivim kedivrei Torah, and they are precious like the words of Torah, as it says, chikeich kiyein hatov, that your palate, referring to the words of sages that emanate from the palate because they're oral, are like the good wine, which is a reference to Torah. Shimon barva b'shem Rabbi Yochanan dodim divrei sofra l'divrei Torah v'chavivim yoter midivrei Torah. Not only are they beloved like the words of Torah, but they're even more precious than the words of Torah. As it says, ki tovim dodecha miyayin. As another pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, that your dodim, your beloved ones, are more important than wine itself. Your friendship, meaning the words of the sages who are the friends of Hashem, are more precious or more important than the yain, than the wine of Torah. Now here we continue. Rabbi Ba Bar Kohen b'shem Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi teda lecha shechavivin divrei sofer midivrei Torah. I'll prove to you that the words of the Chachamim are actually more precious than the words of Torah themselves. We treat them as they are more precious. How do we know this? Shaharei Rabbi Tarfon ilu lo kara lo haya over ela ba'aseh. That let's look at the story of Rabbi Tarfon. Let's say he had failed to recite Kriya Shema altogether. He didn't daven. What was the penalty? He would have violated a mitzvah's aseh in the Torah. Is failure to fulfill a mitzvah's aseh, are you chayiv misa for that? You don't know. All right, listen, you didn't do a mitzvah. You missed the mitzvah. You missed out. You're not allowed to just allow a mitzvah's aseh to lapse, but God's not going to kill you for that. But the fact that he recited Kriya Shema and violated the words of Beis Hillel, meaning that he violated a rabbinic law that you have to follow Beis Hillel, he became liable for the death penalty. So what you see from here is, be more careful with the words of the sages than even the words of the Torah. Now, obviously you understand that this is not an absolute rule, because we also know that Safek de Oraisa l'chumra, Safek de Rabbanan l'kula. There are many instances where we are more lenient with rabbinic law than biblical law. The classic case is if you have a Safek, I'm in doubt whether this is a biblical violation or rabbinic violation. Do I have to go back and do it? Well, if we say Safek de Rabbanan l'kula, if it's a question of rabbinic law, you can be lenient and assume that you've already done the mitzvah. You don't have to go back and do it. But if it's a biblical law and you're not sure if you've done it, you got to go back and do it. So you see that this is not an absolute rule that the words of the sages are always more important than the words of the Torah. But here it seems like the Gemara is expressing a communal, all right, from a societal imperative that we must do everything possible to preserve and uphold the words of the sages, because we have this principle. Sometimes asu chachamim chizuk lidivreihem yoser mishal Torah, that sometimes the rabbis bolstered their words even more than Torah ideas if they saw that the words of the sages were in danger of being violated. And the reason is because since the laws are rabbinic, there's a tendency for people not to take them as seriously because it's the Chachamim who made the rule, not Hashem. So therefore, that's the theme of this Gemara, is that we must do whatever we can to preserve the integrity of Klal Yisrael's practices, which are guided by the words of the sages more than the words of the Torah as far as practical law. And so that's the reason why Rabbi Tarfon is treated so harshly for having threatened the integrity of communal practice. Okay, so I just want to make sure that's.
So if he did it privately, nobody saw it.
Maybe you could argue that he would not have been dealt with as harshly. Yeah. Okay, now and it's al shem uporetz gader yishachenu nachash. There's a pasuk in Koheles that says that he who breaches the fence shall be bitten by a snake. And that is a pasuk that we saw before as well, that it's a teaching that whoever breaches the wall, the words of the Chachamim are called a wall, right? They're called a wall because they create a fence. Susi agla Torah, make a fence around the Torah. That's what it says in Pirkei Avos, right? So if you breach that fence that's been created, even though you haven't actually harmed what's inside the fence, just actually breaching the fence itself causes you to be bitten by a snake. Okay, so okay, if you take a look at footnote number 5 with
But
paragraph
like,
that says Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah mivaer madua onsho shel ha'over al divrei chachamim chomer me'onsho shel ha'over al mitzvah min haTorah. The Rabbeinu Yonah tries to explain why is the punishment greater to when a person violates a mitzvah d'Rabbanan than a mitzvah d'Oraisa or biblical law. He says lefisha ha'over al dinei haTorah b'derech klal ein ze mishum she'enu machshav es divrei haTorah. Because when a person violates a Torah law, it's not because he's disregarding the Torah. Ela mishum sheyitzro mischaber lo v'gorim lo lachto. But rather it's because his Yetzer Hara has gotten the best of him. Like, I have this desire, I really have, I'm chalashing for the cheeseburger. So, so I ate the cheeseburger. The ula'achar mikein hu mischaret umeitzer al ma'aseu. But then afterwards, we assume that he is remorseful. He's filled with regret. Okay, masha'en kein ha'over al divrei chachamim. But when a person violates the words of the sages, shebederach klal ba hadavar mishum shedivreim kalam be'enav. It's usually because their edicts are light in his eyes. V'sover she'ein tzarich lahakbid aleihem kevin she'enam kesuvim b'mefurish b'torah. And his attitude is, it's not so important. It's not like Hashem told me I have to do this. And therefore, in general, his remorse, he's not filled with remorse. He's not filled with this kind of regret. Oh, yeah, violated Hashem's words. He just,
Just total ignorance.
yeah. Okay. On shofamor, inimtza shemavatal bekavana mitzvah mitzvahs haTorah. And therefore, it turns out that his punishment is greater because there's no remorse. Like the remorse itself is a form of tshuva, and therefore God can alleviate that sin. But when you violate the words of the chachamim, not a big deal, and therefore the stain remains. Okay, let us continue. Tani Rebbe Yishmael, Divrei Torah, yesh bahen iser, v'yesh bahen heter, v'yesh bahen kulin, v'yesh bahen chumrin. He says, when it comes to Torah law, there are sometimes the Torah prohibits, sometimes it permits, sometimes there are leniencies, and sometimes there are stringencies. Avol divrei sofrim kulan chamurin hein. But the words of the chachamim are always filled with stringencies, and meaning that there are sometimes in the Torah in Torah law, there are some times where the Torah goes easy on you, and sometimes the Torah doesn't punish you heavily, and sometimes it punishes you heavily. But with the words of the sages, even if you violate the lightest of their prohibitions, the penalty is very heavy. And this is, again, one of the ways of describing how a person has to be more careful with the words of the Chachamim than the words of the Torah.
how do you describe a lighter prohibition? Like you're making classifications with.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, there are certain things that if I violate them, I only get Malkus, I don't get Misa, right? So, right?
So it's either Malchus or Musa.
And sometimes there's no penalty at all. Like when you're over a mitzvah's aseh. So if a person fails to recite Kriya Shema, he violated a mitzvah's aseh, but there's no penalty. It's only in the afterlife.
You just missed out.
You just missed out, right?
But if you miss out Ulav and Esrog,
Also,
you just missed out the mitzvah.
I missed out on a mitzvah's aseh. I mean, Hashem punishes that person, but in a lighter way. The after effects are not punishable in a Beis Din down here, and we don't even know
How that works.
how that works. Yeah.
Rabbi, also, when we talk about could we put, let's say, posek of today? Can we call him that? Like if he gives you soccer or something like that, and we don't listen to it, is that the same sort of way?
It depends how far-reaching his authority is. Like if we'll see later on that you have to follow a posek. In other words, if the person is your posek, and you've chosen him, you've accepted him as your posek, and then you fail to follow his words, that could have this type of ramification. Or if let's say there's a communal posek, a communal standard in the community where there's a rule, right? And like there's something called, for example, Dat Yehudit, the laws of the Jewish woman. If let's say there's a communal standard for tznius, for how women are supposed to dress, even though it's only a rabbinic institution that other communities don't abide by. If a woman were to violate that standard in her own community, she would be held in contempt in the same level that we're describing over here as well. Okay? Now, Teda l'chashu kain, another proof that the words of the sages have to be taken more seriously than the words of the Torah, the Taninan Taman, because we have a Mishnah that in Sanhedrin that talks about a Zakein Mamre. Now, what is a Zakein Mamre? A Zakein Mamre is a category of rabbinic leader who is put to death. Why? Because he fails to conform to the majority rule. So let's say you have a rabbi who's on the Sanhedrin, and he says the halacha is X, and all of the other chachamim say the halacha is Y, and he refuses to conform, and he tells anyone who's in his sphere of influence, you have to go like X, like I said. So we can put him to death because what he's trying to do is undermine the unity of the Jewish people, and the Torah says you put him to death.
But we have that situation, just Sanhedrin, where the whole case with the oven, the one.
The Tanur Shel Achnai.
Yeah, and he was put in cherem.
Well, yes, eventually he was put in cherem. Yeah, because he refused to accept the psak. Yeah. Now, in that situation, you could ask yourself the question, well, why did they put him to death? It could be that it was already after the time when the Sanhedrin was enforcing this law. It could be that it was already.
Wasn't it after
it was after the Churban. It was after the Churban by Hasheni. So maybe they weren't doing Zakin Mamre. And it could also be that it was a story of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer at that time was, even though he hadn't told people to actually act on his psak, he still refused to accept the psak. So because he hadn't yet acted on the psak, he wasn't chayiv misa, but they still put him in cherem because they viewed him as a threat. Okay.
There's an Acher. With Acher, he was put in cherem too. No.
Was he formally put in cherem? I would imagine so, but I'm trying to remember a story of Acher being put in cherem. I don't know. Let me know if you find something.
Because you didn't mention it, your Pirkei Avos.
Yeah,
It's one of the reasons.
He was a big problem for them.
He was a big problem because he informed on the Jews to the Roman government. Yeah, he was a rodef. So he was definitely at some point probably chayiv misa, but I'm not sure if they formally put him in cherem.
So Rabbi, today you have we have this all the time. Well, you can be samach on this one. We had this so many times in Choshen Mishpat. These 6 rabbanim say you can't, and these 2 say you can. And then we always say, what happens if you come to a din Torah? Well, I hold those 2, so I don't have to hold those 4. You have the schism happening all the time, that there's constant contradiction.
In later generations, we have unresolved machlokos. We do, yeah, because we don't have a Sanhedrin anymore to be able to canonize law, say, okay, this is the final psak. That's true, 100%. All right, let us continue. So what are we trying to from here? So let's go back to the law of the Zakein Mamre. Ha'omer ain't tefillin lavor al divrei Torah pater. He says, if a Zakein would say, there's no halacha of tefillin. You don't have to put on tefillin. So he would not be put to death. Why? Because anytime, and this is explicit in the Gemara over there in Sanhedrin, anytime an elder tells you that a certain law that is explicit in the Torah is not there, he doesn't qualify as a Zakein Mamre that has to be put to death. However, Chamesh Totafos, Lahosif al Divrei Sofrim, Chayiv. But if he tells you that yes, there's a mitzvah of tefillin, but instead of there being 4 chambers in the tefillin, there's 5 chambers in the tefillin shel rosh, that person is put to death. Why? because he is instructing you to go against the conventional interpretation of the words of the sages. The sages interpret the word litotafos to mean four chambers. That's, the way that we'll see that later on. Litotafos means four chambers. That's what the word totafos means, or that's at least the way the rabbis interpreted it based on our oral tradition. He says, no, it means five. Because he's violating or going against the rabbinic interpretation that's part of the oral law and not something that's explicitly written in the Torah, he is put to death. So once again, you see that what's the whole concern of a Zaken Mamre, the person who's put to death for dissenting from the rest of the Sanhedrin? He's creating a schism within Klal Yisrael, and he's creating division when the Jewish people have to remain a united religious front. So that's the reason why Zaken Mamre is put to death. That's why, so when he tells you violate something that's explicit in the Torah, no one's going to listen to him. So that's why he's not put to death. He may be doing something wrong, but it's not worthy of the capital punishment. Next, Rabbi Chananya bereda Rav Ada b'shem Rabbi Tanchum b'Rabbi Chia chamurim divrei zakenim and divrei neviim. That you have to be more careful with the words of the zakenim than the words of the neviim. And there's a lot of discussion in this, like who's more important, the prophet or the rabbi, right? Prophet or rabbi. So here they're saying the rabbi his words are more important than the words of the prophet. Why? So here's a pasuk in Sefer Micha. The prophet says, or Hashem says to the prophet, Al tatifu yatifun lo yatifu la'ele lo yisag kalimos, which is explained in literally what it means is, I tell the Navi that he should no longer dispense his words to the people because lo yisag kalimos, they will no longer heed his words, and it becomes a humiliation to the prophet. That if a prophet were to dispense his words of admonition, exhortation to the people, and they would just blow him off, so that's a humiliation, and therefore he must stop dispensing his words. He says, and the reason why Hashem says this is, and the first part of the pasuk is Lu ish holech ruach v'sheker kizev. If they could find a false prophet, and the false prophet would tell them what they wanted to hear, atif l'chalayayin v'la. They would become drunken with his wine and his intoxicants, meaning that they would be happy to hear his words. He would be happy, the people would be happy to accept his words. And basically, what, like the commentary over here says, since the people would much rather hear the false prophets than hear the authentic prophets, that God says to the Nevi'im, stop prophesying. But when it comes to the words of the sages, we never tell the sages to stop dispensing their words. The Chachamim have an obligation to dispense their words even when the people aren't interested in listening. Yeah. So that demonstrates, so like it says in footnote 14, B'nogei l'divrei Chachamim, me'olam lo tziva Hashem l'Chachamim she'yafsiku lahoros, ela adarabba, he mitzuvim tamid lahoros as a halacha. The Chachamim always have to tell people what the halacha is, bein im ha'am makabel uvein im lav, whether people are willing to accept their ruling or not. In other words, just because people are not willing to listen doesn't give you a right to stop doing your job. If you're a rabbi, you have an obligation to try your best to instruct the people. Now, there is still a principle that the Gemara doesn't make note of here. But the Gemara says, at a time when people are receptive, then you should spread your words out further. at a time when people are unreceptive, you should withdraw. It does mean withdraw entirely, but it's referring to like the whole idea of trying to spread the word of Torah farther. There are times when you have to be more conservative in the way that you try to teach Torah.
It's an example.
If you see that people are scornful of the Chachamim, then you have to be more conservative in the way that you teach Torah. But when it comes to, I guess, psak halacha, I guess this is what the Gemara's attitude is over here. You can't not tell people what to do just because you're worried that they're going to be scornful. Okay. The Gemara continues and it says, Navi v'zakin l'mahin domin, l'melech sheshaleach shnei palmatrin shelo la Medina. He says, if we wanted to look at the contrast between a Navi and a Zaken and a rabbi, we would say it's like a king who sends two of his officers to do his bidding to another, to one of the faraway provinces. Al echad mehem kasav im enomar lachem chosem shelo usmanterin shali al ta'aminu lo. V'al echad mehem kasav afal pi she'enomar lachem chosam usmanterin shali ha'aminuhu b'lo chosam usmanterin. He says, the king says in his edict that he sends with these two emissaries, he says, emissary A, you should only accept what he tells you if he shows you the king's seal and the sign that he's been sent by the king. But emissary B, listen to him no matter, regardless of whether he shows you an authentication of his words or not. So therefore, kach ba'navi ksiv and asan elecha os omofes b'ramhacha al pi haTorah asher yorucha. He says, and that's the difference between an elder and a navi. The navi has to show you a sign. What does the Torah say? If a navi comes along and tells you to follow the law, and you've never heard the law before, what does the Torah say? He's got to perform a miracle to authenticate that he's an emissary of God. But a zaken, the rabbi, doesn't have to show you a miracle, even though I'm sure some people would like to see the rabbi do a miracle, right? He doesn't have to show you a miracle. His word is his word. And you just have to follow his word without question, without asking for him to prove his point. And so that once again demonstrates that the words of the Zakenim are stronger or have to be taken more seriously than the words of the Navi. So then the Gemara continues, and it says, Hadad Temar, Mishayatsas Baskol. So now the Gemara is going to qualify when was Rebbe Tarfon liable for his life, meaning the whole import of the Mishnah is that what Rebbe Tarfon did was so wrong that he really deserved to die for having paskin like Beis Shammai over Beis Hillel. So the Gemara wants to clarify that that's not always true, that a person can't be machmir like another opinion. It's only when mishiyatzas baskol, aval ad shelo yatzas baskol, kol harotz lahachmir al atzma v'lino kechumrei Beis Shammai v'chumrei Beis Hillel. He says, but before the baskol, there was a heavenly voice at one point that emanated historically regarding the debates between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And once that Baskol came out and said that the law in almost every instance is like Beis Hillel, it was no longer permissible to go and be machmir like Beis Shammai.
Is that how we know? It was a Baskol?
There was a Baskol. The Gemara says there was a heavenly voice that came out that people could hear and said, we follow the law like Beis Hillel. Halacha ke Beis Hillel b'chol makom. Halacha is like Beis Hillel in all places, right? So what is that? I mean, we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow, God willing, how we understand that idea of a baskol. But that's, once that heavenly voice rang out, it was no longer permissible to even be machmir like Beis Shammai if you wanted to be machmir. However, before that heavenly voice rang out, it was permissible to be machmir like Beis Shammai if you wanted to, and to be machmir like Beis Hillel when you wanted to. Like you could pick and choose. Al zen emar. So if a person was going to be machmir like Beis Shammai and to be machmir like Beis Hillel, that person would be like Al zen emar. About such a person, it says Hakasil b'choshech cholech. The fool walks in the darkness. Meaning, since we're in the dark as far as how to paskin, we don't have a resolution. If you want to be foolish and always be machmir, you have that right. Now, it sounds like from the Gemara that you're not a bad person. You just may be a bit foolish to always be machmir, like whatever opinion you could find. And we'll continue this discussion of Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay.
If I was a Beis Hillel, I would cross the line, and if I was a Beis Shammai, I would cross the line and go to Beis Hillel. Why would I go there if I'm always not ahead?
Because it's like, why do you root for the Maple Leafs when they always lose?
I'm saying that and they don't follow their allotments. Why are they, and that.
Because it's part of their